much, everyone, for being here today at the third Joan Robinson workshop. People come from all over the place, Cambridge, London, and New York State. And that brings me to Professor William, William, that's good work, of Hobart and William Smith College. He's contributed widely to institutional evolutionary approaches, feminist care economics, and collaborated with the former Joan Robinson Fellow, Mary Wren, especially. He's received the full set of institutionalist accolades, positions at Levy, UMKC, and recipient of a Veblen Common Award in 2015. To cap this off, he's now the editor of the JEI. And particularly for the Girton case, he was formerly Helen Cam Visiting Fellow here. And I think it was from the time here that's brought him to the Wootton archives and today's talk. So if everyone will join me in giving a round of applause, and we'll get things going. Thank you.
First of all, I'm honored to be here. This really seems like a disparate topic in some ways because most people don't realize that there is any connection between the Cambridge tradition in economics and original institutional economics. Veblen, of course, had a few things to say about Alfred Marshall, which Steve has written about extensively. Veblen actually thought Marshall was a good deal better than his other marginalist colleagues in that he had a slightly different ontological position that allowed him to consider change and evolutionary change in economics. But I want to talk about more of the commonalities rather than the differences. My particular interest in Barbara Wootton was generated when I was studying with an institutionalist named David Hamilton, who told me while I was working on my degree that in the next semester I was going to read everything Barbara Wootton had written and write a paper on it. And I actually enjoyed that quite a lot. And it became very clear to me that there was a reason for that, that there were affinities between her work. And then Dave Hamilton was the, I'm not sure, was a student of Clarence Ayres, and Marjorie Turner was a student of Clarence Ayres as well and a classmate. And she wrote this book in 1989 where she looked at the relationship between the work of Joan Robinson, and this was not, the American was not Paul Samuelson, it was actually the institutionalist, okay, the original institutionalist. So this goes back a ways. And I'm going to go through some commonalities going backwards pretty quickly to get to the more modern stuff, which I think is more germane. First of all, in the interwar period, Keynes and Veblen both wrote books on the economic consequences of the peace in the case of Keynes, and Veblen wrote an inquiry into the nature of the peace, basically looking at the Treaty of Versailles from essentially the same perspective. One of the things we know is that Keynes' lectures on the economic consequences of the peace were given in that room across the hall. And Barbara Wootton reported that they were the best lectures she heard in her time at Cambridge. Both John Maynard Keynes and Thorstein Veblen articulated a monetary theory of production, first in the general theory by Keynes, but earlier in the theory of business enterprise by Veblen, and both of them emphasized finance in a way that other economists had not up until that time as part of the cause of business cycles. John Maynard Keynes and John R. Commons, the other founder of institutional economics, had very similar impacts on government policy during the Great Depression. And interestingly, Keynes once in a, Keynes argued in a letter that he sent to John R. Commons that John R. Commons' theory of money was the closest to his own, which is kind of interesting. Having read both, I'm not sure Keynes was right about that, but now these are just some other topics that are kind of interesting. Thorstein Veblen and Barbara Wootton shared similar views on consumption, and both argued that planning is always present in industrial economies, and they both argued that wages were not set in labor markets, but by social processes. John Maynard Keynes, Barbara Wootton, and Walton Hamilton, another American institutionalist, argued for the necessity of altering the income distribution. Barbara Wootton and Walton Hamilton agreed on the social determination of wages. They both made nearly identical critiques of J.R. Hick's theory of wages, which is properly back on a shelf there, totally unread. Joan Robinson's imperfect competition, Gardner Means' theory of administered prices, and actually John Maurice Clark's work on pricing were all of alternative ways of doing pricing in non-competitive markets. Joan Robinson noted in her essay on the disintegration of economics that the Cambridge UK concept of capital and its critique of mainstream capital theory and the Cambridge capital controversies was simply a restatement of Thorstein Veblen's arguments in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 1908. Thorstein Veblen, Joan Robinson, and her good friend John Kenneth Galbraith all rejected the notion of consumer sovereignty. And then there's a lot of other more recent ones. So basically, all of these people would have been voted off the island in a mainstream economics department pretty early on. There are also post-Keynesian institutionalists who combine the two approaches. All of these people argue that there was a legitimate role of government in market economies. There are some similarities in ontology. Thorstein Veblen, the founder of original institutionalism, actually had two different ontologies. His first was a biological ontology. He argued that human beings were social animals, so that the notion of methodological individualism was absolutely absurd. Human beings always live in groups. He also noted that as primates go, we weren't very good ones. We had to be born extremely premature because of these large brains, and as a consequence, we needed at least 2 years of continuous care to achieve the level of capacity to support ourselves that a 15-year-old chimpanzee can. So that care had to have been part of the evolutionary process that human beings adapted or acquired at some point along the way, or we simply would not have survived as a species. But Veblen also noted that none of that biological ontology had changed in the last 100,000 years, so that what was really important was the social ontology. He was in the American Academy from 1870 to 1929 and was greatly influenced by three elements in that. First of all, Charles Darwin's concept of evolution. The concept of culture is developed by anthropologists. In fact, William Graham Sumner was his dissertation advisor. And then pragmatic philosophy. He was a student of Charles Peirce at Johns Hopkins. His classmate was a guy named John Dewey, so it's probably a pretty tough room. And so it was those elements that contributed to his particular notion of human behavior. Of course, Veblen and Sen have some similarities. Veblen argued that the purpose of the economy was to provision the community, and in provisioning he meant the generic ends of life, very similar to a basic needs type understanding. And he thought that those activities that were adopted by a community that did not contribute to the generic ends of life were okay as long as they didn't get in the way of that. And so he also developed a concept of waste, which other economic approaches did not. Barbara Wootton was one of the first people to write books on planning, and her conclusion was all economies are planned. The only question is who's doing the planning. And they all of these people rejected mainstream methodology. Veblen's essays in the place of science are very critical of the economics of his day. And the interesting thing is nobody was spared. He really didn't like the marginalists, besides the fact that John Bates Clark was his teacher. He wrote a scathing essay about that, which Professor Clark took well, and John Maurice Clark adopted Thorstein Veblen's views rather than his father's. Of course, Barbara Wootton's lament for economics is a response to Lionel Robbins' The Nature and Significance of Economic Science. She has a chapter in there called The Nature and Insignificance of Economic Science, followed by a chapter called Economics as Apologetics. So she had a very dim view of mainstream economics methodologically, and eventually in the 1950s she gave up on it and wrote a book called Testament for the Social Sciences, where she just basically talked herself right out of economics for a while. All of these economists are realists. They accept that all effects have causes, and all are interested in the constitution of social organization. All share the understanding that capitalism is fundamentally unstable, and that the cause of this is finance. Veblen's, Keynes, Minsky, and many others. The question of the nature of social organization, its constitution, its relationship to the emergence of social institutions, the nature and processes of social positions and roles, and the operations and significance of power are of common interest, particularly with a group of institutionalists referred to as the radical institutionalists and our contemporary Cambridge Social Ontology group. Social positioning, social roles, and gender are of interest to that group. And interesting, Clive Lawson and Clarence Ayre shared very similar theories of technology. Clive Lawson being a fellow here at Girton. So there's a lot that's going on, but I want to talk about the more recent things that I've been working on that apparently have been inflicted on some of the students in the past few days. In the 1980s and 90s, a younger institutional economist named William Duggar developed a theory of power, and he broke away from the rather reformist approach of most institutionalists who were very interested in pragmatic problem solving in some cases and sort of doing minimal changes in the social structure to not disrupt the culture as much as possible. He had a friend who said that actually the nature of the change of the economy at any given point should be a reflection of the size of the problem, not the size of the solution, that those two things would have to correspond and that reform might not be the way to go. And he developed a theory of power where power was based within institutions. All right. This is very similar to the notion of social positioning articulated by the Cambridge Social Ontology group, where social relations are individuals in social positions that are related to other social positions where rights and obligations are shared. That language is more specific than what Duggar used. He talked about roles. He said that the power within institutions is exercised by individuals, but individuals in a particular role. The power went with the role, not with the individual, okay? And that there would be subordinate positions to that with matched rights and obligations. But he said more than that, because institutions are, many things are social institutions. Manners are minor social institutions, and then there are very complex ones. The one I like to talk about to my students is it's really hard to see how you get from Socrates talking to the youth of Athens to Cambridge University. A whole lot of social construction and social relations built up to get you there. And we can understand that diachronically. We can look back and look at how these institutions evolved, but we don't have a real good sense of why these more complex structures emerged at a particular point in time in a particular way. We don't even know if they're not all historically unique and contingent. But one of the things about this that Duggar noticed is that it's not just singular institutions. Institutions occur in clusters. And one ungenerous colleague of mine, when we were talking about this, said, "What the devil are clusters?" And that's an excellent ontological question, okay? Institutions generally are connected to one another, but the nature of that collection, Duggar simply assumed. And I think that the Cambridge Social Ontology Group, by focusing on social positions and the fact that those positions can be nested in different social structures and related in parallel structures, allows us to understand the nature of institutions a good deal more precisely. Okay? Institutions are, by their very nature, social structure which contributes to some stability. Largely, it grows out of first finding a successful solution to a problem and repeating it, right? Eventually, it becomes a routine for an individual. One of the things all primates do is they imitate. So when we see somebody doing something that works, unless we are a fool or the current president of the United States, we learn from that. And we imitate that. So imitation is a part of our human. But human beings also do something different. They imitate for the purpose of status. And Veblen called that emulation. So both of these processes are going on at the same time. Eventually, that sharing leads to customs, rules, social norms. But how they get formalized beyond that, and they do obviously, is a much more difficult story. How they're selected for is also difficult. Veblen argued that, in fact, the evolutionary process worked itself out in cultures as an evolutionary culture where institutions evolved in relationship with their environment. Another institutionalist, age is a wonderful thing. Kenneth Boulding expanded upon that and said it's actually with the entire biosphere. It's not just the social constructs that relate to this, but that the nature of that social evolution is the evolution of institutions. Institutions are stable because we repeat them, we do them, saves on cognitive effort. You know, you don't have to get up every morning and learn how to tie your shoes. For people who are my age, that makes sense. This is something you had to sit down with every child before they went to school and teach them to do, and then they invented Velcro and parents became redundant. But those of us who still tie our shoes, we don't think about it. We don't even remember doing it in the morning. We look at our feet and go, how did those get on there? So that's the nature of these sorts of habits of thought and action that institutions are made up of. But they do change when circumstances change, right? And Velcro changed the way we deal with the issue of having your kids' shoes stay on them. And when we look at just the technological change that we all experience looking back over the last 30 years, regardless of which 30 years since the invention of agriculture you're looking at, it always looks like it's increasing. And all of that new knowledge and new patterns of usage, new technology, causes us to adjust and causes institutions to change to some degree. That said, institutions do not change willy-nilly. You are in Cambridge University. There's a lot of customary behavior going on here. In fact, we're engaged in it right now. I'm standing up here talking in a microphone, and you're all sitting there nodding politely and pretending like you're paying attention, right? That's just part of the social convention, you know. And nobody had to tell you where you sat. Nobody had to tell you what you were supposed to do, you know. Everybody goes through the process, and it just makes it go smoother. The classroom is one of the most structured, conservative things that you can ever imagine. And it works because everybody walks in, even at the first day, they have a pretty good idea what they're supposed to do. So there's that conservative tendency in institutions, but occasionally there's a mismatch or obsolescence that comes about because of social innovation, technological innovation, mistakes, environmental changes, or just the repetition of the activity. In rural America, for generations and generations, people took their waste products and buried them on the farm. And then when that became inconvenient, they just started burying them in some vacant land, and now we have mountains of this stuff all over the place and no place to put it. Just this repetition of the same simple behavior over and over has created an environmental crisis with regard to how we eliminate waste materials, and we adjust to that by recycling and all sorts of things. In the United States, we mostly turn them into golf courses because you can't live on these things. So, whoa. So much for plastic belts, an innovation whose time hasn't come. And so contemporary institutional economists look at these sorts of questions of how these institutions, the social positions within them are related, how the social organizations relate to one another, and then mostly in the context of solving particular problems, but also thinking about systematic questions. To some degree, that's became a bigger part of institutional economics with the Cambridge tradition. The attention paid to economic aggregates, to while some degree Wesley Clare Mitchell began to compile the information to do that, he really didn't think about it when he was putting together the United States national income accounts at the National Bureau of Economic Research prior to the general theory. And that also made it difficult for him to theorize about business cycles, not having that conceptual apparatus of thinking about things in the aggregate as a system of causal relations. One of the issues where Duggar's conception fell apart was it's really easy to talk about power within a particular institution. You can sit down and you can look at the various roles and rights and obligations and determine who has power and the power to act and who has the responsibility to respond to those actions. But we live in societies where there are power relations which transcend particular institutions, and there's a real question about how those came about. Duggar's suspicion, and here we're talking about issues like race, gender, nationality, ethnicity, that are across all of our institutions and run throughout all of our social structures. His intuition was that in each society, some of these things got their origin within particular institutional structures, but moved outside of them. The gendered division of labor within family structures seems like a likely place for patriarchy to have evolved or emerged, but that doesn't explain how it became a societal-wide system of power that has crossed generations, cultures, and now envelops us in our entire existence. The same with race. In the United States, the way race was defined, it was closely tied to slavery, but there are concepts of race in different parts of the world, and they are just as toxic, and they are not tied to a particular institution, but maybe many institutions. And Duggar's framework can't deal with this. Social positioning theory can, and the way Tony Lawson has talked about this in the last 48 hours is he thinks of social positions as embedded in social organizations as sort of like a giant Venn diagram with circles within circles within circles, and that at some point social positions associated with race, citizenship, gender, simply come when you enter the world and become part of a community, and they place you in those categories and in those roles, and they have escaped whatever institutional structure generated them in the first place. Once you have that notion, you've cut loose from particular institutional structures or particular clusters, whatever those might be, in terms of understanding them, and can see how they can permeate all of those simultaneously and have an impact on the way that each and every social institution in our society operates in each and every social organization, depending upon what your preferred terminology is. As was mentioned, I do a lot of work on the economics of care, and there's an interesting thing about the history of care in the United States, and that is that from the beginning of colonization, care has largely been coerced in the United States. It's not done voluntarily. When the first Europeans moved, they brought about indentured servants. All right. The way you became an indentured servant, by the way, is you got arrested for some serious crime, generally in a major city in the UK. The most common one, particularly for women, was loitering. And the penalty for loitering was death or transport, which seems a little over the top for spending, more than 15 minutes on a park bench in London. But that could get you sent to the United States. Why would they engage in that? Because there was a shortage of domestic help in the United States. And what this did is it supplied domestic help to wealthy colonists in the United States. And there was, of course, a never-ending number of poor people in industrial cities at that time who did that. There was one difficulty with this particular system. The indentured servants were also citizens of the UK for the most part, and it was very easy to disappear into the population. So very few indentured servants in the United States actually fulfilled their contract or their indenture. So we solved that problem by getting slaves from Africa, and when we couldn't get them from Africa, from the Caribbean. And then racial distinctions became very important. The slaves were easily identifiable. They were easily retrieved. And that provided domestic service as well as slave labor in the United States up until the 1850s and 1860s in the Civil War. After that, of course, we had another crisis in finding caring workers. The ingenuity of Americans of coercing people into doing caring labor is almost without bounds. We then created the Indian schools for the indigenous Americans. We took their children away from them, would not allow them to speak their languages, taught them English, and gave them vocational training. The boys got training in construction, which still is where an awful lot of indigenous Americans work, and you can guess what the young women were trained for: domestic service. So that worked for a while, and then we just decided we would use immigrant labor for that, particularly from poor countries up until today, where a huge amount of our caring labor is provided at very low wages by both documented and undocumented workers in the United States. It's overwhelmingly done by women with low levels of education. The work is contingent. It pays badly. It is difficult work. And there is right now a tragic shortage of care workers in the United States because there's a burden of care that's growing in rather dramatic ways in the United States. A couple of things have been happening. First of all, Americans, despite our health system, seem to be living longer. But also because of the expense of education, American young people are marrying later and reproducing later. So their daycare costs, my daughter has 2 children, her daycare costs are more than her home mortgage per month. Okay, and she has a nice house. This is, $2,000 a month for daycare. And, I'm already counting the days until I'm moving in and she has to take care of me, right? So we call this a sandwich problem in care, where by delaying marriage, households are having young children in the house at the same time the family is caring for the elderly parents. And while Americans' life expectancy is going up, I mentioned the quality of health care, their healthy years of life is not going up. All right, it's actually diminishing. So they're needing more care. And of course, We live in a neoliberal world now. We live in a failed neoliberal world. I think there's no way we can get around this any longer. And the neoliberal ideology has historically placed care within the household and outside of the economic and political public sphere. The responsibility for care falls upon the household. In the event that the household can't take care of it, they're allowed to resort to the market and hire people to do that, but that presumes that they can afford to do so, and that is another element of the current crisis. Okay, so we have this crisis in care. It's absolutely essential for our survival, and we have a public political ideology which argues that the burden for that cannot be taken on socially, but has to be taken on by the households. The notion of social care in the United States was resisted for a very long period of time. It had a brief shining moment, and I mean literally a moment, in 1935. The Social Security Act of 1935 put most of our paltry social welfare state in place during the Great Depression. These programs were amazingly successful. They eliminated poverty among the elderly almost overnight, which was the largest group in poverty in 1935, simply because your eligibility was retroactive. So the day the act was passed, elderly people began receiving pensions. It included disability insurance, unemployment insurance, aid to families with dependent children, and several other programs, all of which, by the way, were pioneered in the state of Wisconsin, where they were developed by the students of John R. Commons, the other founder of institutional economics, who made up the economists who were imported into Washington, displacing their mainstream colleagues in the government of the New Deal. Those programs have been solidly in place, but in 1973, the United States did one of its more seriously bad debates about how we should handle the issue of deindustrialization. In 1973, when the price of oil went up 300% basically overnight, many of the industrialized countries began to look at policies with which to deal with that, and our response was, well, let the private sector take care of that. They'll do everything efficiently, and they sure as hell did. They knew they would have to build new manufacturing facilities, and they did, just not in the United States. Okay, and there was no program to retire their old capital, as there were in some of the Asian countries. There was no program or incentives for them to rebuild in the United States, so they did the rational thing that you would have expected them to do. They went someplace else where labor costs were lower, where they could get subsidized construction of their production facilities, and the U.S. deindustrialized rather rapidly. From 1945 to 1973, the American working class had the highest standard of living of the working class in any country. They earned good. The white unionized working class had good wages. They could afford to buy a home, buy 2 cars. That tells you a lot about America. Live in a nice suburb, have a swimming pool, and aspire to having their children go to college. And, oh, by the way, college then was free. Thank you. We've chipped away at that ever since. All right, the first was the demonization of people who needed income support, particularly welfare. A mythology arose around that, leading to its political unpopularity. An interesting element of this, which goes back to the notion of social positioning, is that in 1935, when aid to families with to dependent children, what we came to call welfare, income support, was put in place, it was amazingly popular throughout the United States. No one was complaining about it. It became unpopular in 1964. In 1964, the U.S. Civil Rights Act was passed, where the federal government would guarantee access to those benefits to people of color. The way payments were allocated is that each state received an allocation from the federal government based on the number of poor people within their state. The southern states had very high populations of poor people requiring income support. However, 60% of them were African Americans who would not go into a county office to apply for welfare because it would be the equivalent of asking to be killed. In 1964, the federal government enforced that, and all of a sudden those states could no longer keep that surplus. They had to actually distribute it to people of color, and the popularity of the program sank dramatically, and the myth of the welfare queen was born, of a woman who was having multiple children for the purpose of collecting welfare. This mythology eventually succeeded. In 1996, Bill Clinton, yet another neoliberal president, eliminated welfare as we knew it, putting work requirements on that, which were absolutely ridiculous because most of the people on this program were in job deserts in the first place, so they were riding buses all day so that they could work in a daycare center watching somebody else's kids to pay for the daycare that their kids were in. And then other aspects. As of 2 days ago, 7,000 employees of the Social Security Administration were fired by Donald Trump. Social Security is the most efficient government program the United States has ever had. It takes about 30 cents to deliver the benefits to a receiver of Social Security pension benefits. It's not like you can be disqualified for Social Security. Once you're old, you kind of stay old. Nobody gets younger and falls out of eligibility, so there's very little of the kind of policing or recertification that you find in other income-based programs. So based on this ideology that the state can't do anything right, that the private sector always does everything most effectively, and that care should be located in the household, we have dismantled what little welfare system that the social welfare state that the United States has ever had. Housing support's been eliminated. And the peculiar thing is that these programs worked and were successful. The ideology which displaced the optimism associated with the period 1945 to 1973 was not by accident. Right? There was a deliberate attempt, largely by economists, to transform the public's thinking about how economies should be operated. And so the first thing it was actually Jimmy Carter who deregulated the banking system in the United States and the airlines, which lead to the disastrous experience I had over the last 24 hours, where you get to fly to all kinds of weird places to get someplace else. So that there was a dismantling of regulatory institutions in the United States that were functioning relatively well, but that there was an ideological reason for their dissolving. And this is the way institutions often work. They're stabilizing, but people cease to be aware of the reason that they were there in the first place. And a mythology grows up around them, and a counter-narrative can be produced which can undermine that perspective. There's somebody I used to write with who has written quite a bit on this. Help me out here, Mary. On the fact that a lot of our time as institutionalists is examining the particular narratives that justify a particular form of social organization or social structure, social institution, and whether or not our narrative supports the reality of the circumstances or appeals to some mythological golden age in the past where markets work perfectly and the economy worked perfectly, and that serves as a justification for eliminating perfectly good programs. So I see that there is a pretty strong parallel where these two strands of contemporary economics come together. The original institutionalists have a good understanding of institutions and how they're created, and it's not by them competing with one another or people picking efficient ones and them surviving. They develop in an evolutionary way in a particular cultural context. They stay there until they're disrupted, either by choice or by circumstances. Veblen actually said that we were more likely to engage in blind drift than actually do anything useful. But if we didn't at least try, we would experience the triumph of imbecile institutions, which would destroy our culture. And I think we're looking at an example of imbecile institutions emerging in great numbers right now. So Veblen was a pessimist. He did not think we were going to do so well, and I think he was probably right. At least I'm feeling that way today. So those are the two frameworks and how I knit them together in my own work, and I find it a useful way for thinking about social problems, and I've had a lot of help in thinking about these things, and many of the people I've thought about them with are in this room, so that's why it's been a great pleasure to talk to you about this. I know you read a bunch of stuff, or some of you did, and you may have some questions, and Adonis said I should be prepared to answer your questions, so anyone but Mary can ask a question.
You have at least 10 minutes if you want to speak about all sorts of stuff, by the way.
Okay.
If you're doing this for us.
Pardon me?
If you're doing this for us.
Well, there are some fun things that I have learned in the archives here about.
You've got 70 slides on there.
No, Mary makes me do PowerPoints, and so my first act of resistance was to put.
Getting rid of it.
Yeah, I would do PowerPoints with 10,000 words per PowerPoint page, with references. So this was a major success for me here, right? You know. Okay, an improvement. She's a tough crowd. One of the things that most intrigued me about Barbara Wootton when I first encountered her work is that she wrote a book on wage determination in the United Kingdom. She had debated income distribution and wages with Hicks, and her theory of wages was very similar to that of Walton Hamilton. But the book, The Social Foundations of British Wage Policy, was interesting because it just eliminated the labor market as having anything to do with wages. What she argued was that wages were set by virtue of the relative status of the occupations at the time in that community, and that while you would hope that there would be some element of class consciousness which would lead to a more equitable distribution of income, the workers themselves were unwilling to contemplate that because their relative status and their wage was tied to their occupation. And in particular, she saw craft unions as one of the biggest problems. She described their bargaining technique as smash and grab at the expense of everyone else. So as someone who had quite a progressive agenda, having been, part of the Beveridge Commission and the development of the welfare state, she had a very low opinion of British unions. And the book actually goes in details, you have workers in these industries who are the lowest paid, and then you have, manual labor, skilled manual labor, and then she points out that, but then there's these low-level government clerks and bank tellers and stuff who actually don't make as much as the skilled laborers do, but they're all very jealous of where they fit, and so if one group gets a bump up, the whole system moves, and the intervals between them remains the same, which is actually very similar to Veblen's theory of consumption, where people engage in pecuniary emulation. They don't necessarily consume to show off, but to fit in the community and the reference group of which they're a part. It's sort of a fitting in and maintaining social status, and certainly not letting your status decrease. And she saw the same behavior in the labor market. And I think that's probably where the mainstream theory of wages fails most miserably. You treat labor as homogeneous, and you can't suss out any of that sort of distinction of the status. And then, of course, we have all the people in this room. We're in a profession with a lot of status and no pay, so we may be the exception. There are a number of professions like academics. Clergy, for example, have fairly high status in most societies, but the compensation isn't commensurate with the status. But for the most part, it's skill, importance, connection to power that determines the wages and not the supply and demand. I noticed I was sitting out in the lobby today and looking at last year's, the publication of the 100 companies most hiring recent college graduates, and it's like a who's who of the status of British companies and employers, just as it was, and the wages correspond, by the way, in a nice systematic manner. So I think that was prescient, and I think it located her, at least in the mind of institutionalists, as solidly in our tradition, because it was a cultural explanation of wages and not of some omniscient powers of the law of supply and the law of demand and these forces coming together in some balancing act of equilibrium. No, it was a dynamic process. It was changing all the time, but it had a structural stability to it as a result of the institutional structures. And of course it changed as jobs changed. It's dynamic. The evolutionary process is constant, but like biological evolution, it's not fast. It is faster than biological evolution, by the way. We're not making a lot of progress there. And of course, the compensation also has to do with your ability to extract part of the social surplus. So in the United States now, 30% of employment is in finance. The need for finance in the United States probably should take up about 5% of the economy. Most of the rest seems to be legalized gambling for rich people, or at least mindless exchanges of securities that nobody really knows what's underlying them for the purpose of generating fees for the companies that create them and sell them. But when you think about, and these are this 30% are some of the highest paid employees in our economy, when you realize that they don't actually produce anything you can consume, think about how much of the social surplus that's generated by the people who do actually produce goods and services for consumption that they are appropriating into this very bizarre system of, as the anthropologist David Graeber labeled them, bullshit jobs that actually contribute nothing to the generic means of life. So, yeah, that was one of the more fascinating things. Her critique of mainstream economics is absolutely blistering. She referred to mainstream economics as navicular contemplation, staring into your own belly button, which I thought was rather clever. She had a wicked sense of humor. And if you don't know anything about her, she was one of the first 4 women made peers in the UK. She was one of the original governors of the BBC and was a was frequently debating public affairs and radio. She was on the Beveridge Commission. She taught here at Cambridge. Austin Robinson said that she was the best teacher he ever had in economics. Interestingly, her student Joan didn't say that, but and he did attend when she got her honorary doctorate in the 1980s. Let's see what else. There's some other amazing things. Her thinking in economics continually evolved. I remember in one of her early books she was talking about that Master Maynard seemed to have some interesting ideas on how the economy worked, and yet one of her last books was on national incomes policy, so we know that her thinking developed along those lines. And on that, she corresponded with John Kenneth Galbraith on a regular basis. So both Joan Robinson and Barbara Wootton were good friends of John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a very prominent interwar and post-war institutional economist. Joan Robinson once said that she thought that John Kenneth Galbraith's theory of consumption was correct, but that it would get nowhere because it was too well written. So iconoclastic people are just fun. which is why I like the people in this room. That's about what I have. You win.
I can start. Oh, gosh. Okay. No one going to jump in?
I'm not an economist, so if I use a word wrong, in good faith, you can figure out what you think it means. I was wondering what you were talking about institutions that are successful to the point where people forget the reason for the institution existing in the first place, and how one of the things that is discussed most in like the tabloids and the media about like big economic policies at the moment is this idea of a 4-day work week. And I think that something people seem to not discuss in those conversations is the idea of a weekend originally also not existing and having to be fought for. And I was wondering whether at the moment in those conversations about the idea of a 4-day work week and trials, and is it more productive, is it less productive, whether you think all areas of the discussion are being covered or whether there are big things that are being missed out, whether you have any thoughts on that in general and the way it's being discussed at the moment.
Yes, I have some ideas. Would you like to hear them? Okay. The number of hours worked on a weekly basis stopped declining in the United States in the 1950s and has been going up ever since. There are a couple major reasons for that. The first is the decline of labor unions who negotiated weekends and everything, getting the workday down from 12, 16 hours down to 8 hours a day. But there are other institutional factors that affect that a great deal. In the United States, salaried employees are not paid for extra hours of work, and so there's been a move towards salaried jobs. And the advantage of that is that there's certain fixed costs associated with having another employee, and so that if you can get somebody to work twice as many hours for that same fixed cost, and the big one in the United States is health care, which makes up 21% of the wage bill, right? So if you hire 2 people to work 40 hours a week, you have to buy 2 health insurance policies if it comes through work. So there's a huge savings. There's a huge savings on pension contributions. Even if you have to pay those people more, as long as you don't have to pay them twice as much, you just take them, work them to death, burn them out, replace them. So there's institutions that we put in place, in particular in the United States, that encourage longer working hours. And part of that is because health insurance and benefits are not taxed in the United States, but wages are. So the unions, when their wages became adequate, began to negotiate for benefits which were not taxed. And it didn't matter to the employer at that time which way they spent the money, so that seemed like a good bargain. But what it did is it created this incentive to have fewer and fewer employees because that's a fixed cost. So the decline of unions and the inability to reverse that and our dependence on employer-related health care is a huge in the United States. European nations have lowered their work week, though not dramatically. And the argument, of course, is that it's not competitive. You know, you need to have people working longer, and which is just, you know, if we could take that, 25% of those people working in finance and have them work 12 hours a week doing something useful, we could cut everybody else's hours to some degree. So when you have I guess 70% of the population producing the goods and services and the rest of them finding new ways of resorting them, you have to ask yourself, do we really need to do that much work? And then there's just overproduction is the American way of life. I own a small farm, and except for large corporations, nobody makes money farming. The whole object is to lose money farming because you get government subsidies for doing that. The United States produces so much food. Most places in the world don't need to. We could give it to them, all right? the price of agricultural products in the United States, absent government subsidies to agriculture, the price, except for eggs these days, would be zero. Right? We grow corn to feed the other animals. We grow corn to turn it into alcohol, which I approve of if I were going to drink the alcohol, but it's really expensive fuel for vehicles. In fact, there's an energy loss in making ethanol out of corn. It takes more energy to turn it into ethanol than you get from the ethanol. So it's just a subsidy to grow corn in Iowa, which probably should have never been cultivated in the first place. And the soil is not appropriate for that. You can grow sawgrass anywhere in the Great Plains. You can cut it and make ethanol out of it very inexpensively. But then you're not a real farmer if you're growing sawgrass. So you see the whole cultural thing feeding back into that. We overproduce agricultural products. We pay farmers not to grow any more of it, and then we buy their excess, and then we pay them to store it in their grain elevator. And then we give it away to somebody, or we feed it to cows, which again is very inefficient use of agricultural products. And as you can probably tell, most Americans don't need more meat. We're getting plenty of protein. And so we are desperately dependent upon exports to keep those subsidies under control, and we in the last 3 to 4 weeks we've pretty much ended that. Canada just put a total ban on the importation of bourbon from Kentucky in revenge. And by the way, I live in part of New York State where New York State buys 25% of its electricity from Canada. There's these big waterfall. Yeah, Canada owns the power plant, and they sell it to New York. And they're not going to do that anymore. You know, so it's like we're kind of tearing up institutions willy-nilly and doing silly things that don't deal with the real problems of provisioning that we have. We love the family farm. We mythologize it, we talk about it, and if you've ever met a farm family, the children can't get out of there fast enough. It's very hard work. It's not very remunerative unless you have thousands and thousands of acres. And I rent my land to a guy who farms thousands of acres. He makes money, and I get tax benefits. So you get these kind of perverse incentives built into institutional structures, which actually served a legitimate purpose at one time. You know, during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, when agriculture was in desperate straits in the United States, a lot of these subsidies went for irrigation, building windbreaks, rebuilding the soil, supporting farmers as they got back on their feet, and then it just continued without any variation because of the vested interest who benefited from those programs with no adjustment. And now removing them would be catastrophic if you did it all at once. It's the same sort of thing. American corporations, for example, would love single-payer health care insurance. They don't want to pay 20% of their wage. That would be 20% added to their profit margin if they could offload that, right? And we have all kinds of excess capacity. It's just distributed in weird sorts of ways. And the United States spends 3 times more per person on health care than any of the European nations or other developed nations. I was looking at the data. I think the UK spends about the equivalent of $6,000 per person. The United States is between $12,000 and $18,000 per person. And a huge portion of our population does not have access to that health care. So we have great health care if you can afford it, and not such great health care if you can't. Is that too much of an answer? More than you wanted to know?
It might seem sort of a bit of an omission, but in terms of institutional economics, it seems that lots of economists seem to jump to sort of an implicit definition or just completely and utterly bypass it. But in terms of like defining an institution, it seems that a lot of institutionalists don't actually agree on what an institution is or utilize different implicit definitions. How would you define institution and what an institution is? And how would that relate to how a lot of the people you've spoken to would have defined it.
Boy, I wish I was on my computer right now because I have this document with like 14 different definitions of institutions. My personal favorite actually comes from Veblen, and it's probably the least specific, and that is habits of thought and habits of action organized in such a way as to provision society or inhibit society. Other definitions, Jeff Hodgson has a laundry list of everything that constitutes an institution. He's not wrong, but I don't see that having an exhaustive list of different institutions as examples of what institutions is tells us anything about what their ontology is, because it looks just like a jumble of different forms of social organization. But all of them incorporate.
A bit closer to the microphone.
Oh, but
Otherwise you can use that. I think you can
okay.
just grab it and you can move around. Yes.
All of them incorporate routinized behavior that is structured and eventually taken for granted, and that evolves slowly over time. So those are the characteristics of it. A lot of anthropologists think of it in a much more dynamic sense than a list. One institutionalist described it as patterns of correlated behavior, and they meant complex systems of coordinated behavior. I think it's a bad definition, but I can see what they're getting at there. Mary?
Yeah, just following on that. Oh, thank you. I don't think I need it, but
This is
wow.
this is recorded also.
Oh, okay. Can you just specify the difference between new institutionalism and old institutionalism? Because I think that might be part of what Alex is getting at,
Okay.
especially since the fake Nobel went to some new institutionalists recently.
Okay.
There's also a paper 4.
Yes, paper
that
4.
covers
Okay.
institutional economics.
I'm going to give you a longer answer here.
That was the short.
In the 1970s, mainstream economists discovered that there was such a thing as social organization. Okay, it wasn't just a group of individuals acting on their own and magically coordination occurred. They recognized that there were institutions, and in fact that markets were institutions. They did not inquire very much initially as to where they came from. They just acknowledged they were there. Oliver E. Williamson just simply borrowed John R. Common's notion of transactions, and from that, transactions cost. Veblen talked about property rights in a book called Absentee Ownership, and Ronald Coase, of course, developed the notion of property rights. I think if you want to look at, there are a lot of different sorts of new institutionalists. One of the interesting things that they evaluate institutions on is the notion of efficiency, which they get from the notion of market efficiency, without defining what an efficient institution would actually be. Or to put it another way, efficient for what? Okay. The other question they have is, that's different, is they're looking for institutions which, and Douglas North was very big on this. In his first book, North and Thomas and the Rise of the Western World, what he talks about there is the driver of economic development is population and the reactions to changes in the population going back to the plague. But then he begins to look at social structures and see that some social structures seem to facilitate the development of capitalism. You have to keep in mind he's an economic historian, so he was looking at the Industrial Revolution, what came out. And so those were the social institutions he focused on in his earlier work. As he began to think about it more theoretically, he came to the notion that the evolution of institutions was based on the societies that developed had clearly chosen the most efficient institutions for that particular kind of development, and thus if other countries wanted to imitate that, they would have to adopt the same institutional structure. And so that becomes sort of a tacit theory of efficiency, in that the evolution of institutions is a selection process of societies selecting efficient institutions for whatever their particular goal happens to be. And since the rise of the Western world was for him the epitome of human accomplishment, then there was a fairly particular set of clearly defined property rights, the protection of property rights, legal systems that protected property rights, things of that sort that he thought were quite effective. But Douglass North's thinking evolved through his career, and his last book actually does begin to look at the relationship between the evolution of institutions and social change. But then it kind of stopped, and his students have gone forward in different directions. But the definition of institutions there is much closer to Jeff Hodgson's notion of, which Jeff calls legal institutionalism. What are the legal structures, the governmental structures, the market structures, the things that keep property rights secure, that facilitate a particular social order? And Veblen, like I said, was a pessimistic person with that. He just thought that they would evolve, and sometimes we'd make good choices and sometimes we'd make really bad choices. But the institutions might persist anyway. His view was you didn't select the efficient ones, you did the best you could with your options out there, and you hoped like the devil that it worked, but he wasn't optimistic. So I guess the most optimistic thing you can put on Veblen's notion of institutions is you might as well try and do something good, because if you don't, you're just going to drift, and that's probably going to be bad. There was a whole generation of institutionalists after Veblen who were very reformist in character, and they looked at institutions a little bit differently. Clarence Ayres thought that there were two kinds of institutions: ceremonial institutions and technological institutions. Technological institutions were about using warranted knowledge to solve problems using technology, and ceremonial institutions were those that were past-looking, based on power relations, legends, and mythology. That's a profoundly dualistic way of looking at institutions, in my view. It is certainly the case that institutions are always made up of some combination of both real knowledge and useful stuff, or things that used to be useful, and of course the social norms and belief structures that we have that support them. So I think that was a dead end. But I would think if the new institutionalism continues as a significant part of mainstream economics, that there will be some convergence in the conversations about it. I think that the discussion of managing the commons is a useful topic that both groups talk about. I think that the mythology of property rights is almost unrecoverable as a discourse, because we confound productive property with personal property. I mean, there are thousands of Americans worried that the state's going to come and steal their toothbrush. It's like, who cares? It's not about personal property, it's about productive property and who controls that. And we might want to think about redefining property rights in a way that makes that kind of meaningful distinction in what we're talking about. Is that helpful? Sorry.
I'll finally get around to asking my own. Just coming off the conversation about Galbraith and the other students of Commons in the 30s and their contributions, and I guess Wootton's role in the foundation of the welfare state, as someone else has been round about. It seemed like there was a fruitful flourishing across the West of an economics or public policy to some extent that could have evolved into something that you might be a bit more favourable of in that Veblen, the things that we all like for the reasons we're here. That's what I'm trying to say. I was wondering if you could go a little bit further into your own account about why the discipline and its connection to the facilitation of policy went in a way that I think many of us, and what you said in your speech, it is profoundly misguided.
Well, it goes back to the foundation of the discipline of political economy coming out of natural rights and natural law philosophy in the work of Adam Smith, which focused on the individual and a whole legendary construct of an individual in the state of nature. I mean, John Locke's talking about we all got together and had a social contract. I apparently missed that meeting. That obviously never happened, but it provided a methodological foundation for thinking about economies prior to us having a very sophisticated notion of society and way prior to us having an understanding of the concept of culture. Now, as the other social sciences and even philosophy developed, economics remained locked into that framework, sort of Newtonian natural law framework, and had some success with it professionally and didn't move away from that. It is really hard to talk about a social welfare state when you're talking about separate individuals coming together and figuring out a way of solving a problem. You need social organization for that. Social organization generally takes form of institutions. Institutions carry all this cultural baggage, so it requires much more systematic characterization of it. I think the United States is particularly backward because we did not suffer the catastrophic consequences that Europe did after World War II. It isn't like the National Health Service resulted from a brilliant progressive plan. There was no health care, and there were a lot of very ill, very badly injured people in the United Kingdom, and if they weren't all going to die, something different had to be tried. Right? Founding insurance companies really wasn't whereas the United States never faced a crisis like that would compel them to engage in institutional innovations on that scale. The terrifying thing is that might be the only way we can do it. When Barack Obama signed the Health Care Act that bears his name, the Affordable Care Act, he literally stood up and said, obviously the solution to our healthcare problem is a single-payer system, but if I sign a bill that causes 15,000 insurance company workers to lose their jobs, I will never get reelected. So day-to-day politics cannot make that kind of radical change. We're going to be forced into it. And you can just see, seriously, climate change denial, that's just willfully ignoring reality at this point. There's no real controversy over this in the scientific community, and yet we are backtracking in the United States. We just cut away the subsidies for non-gasoline powered automobiles. It's like, are you kidding me? Right? In 1982, I pointed out that we had a problem in this regard, that by the time we get around to doing anything about it, it may be too late. We do not know how much damage we have done to the environment, and we don't know what the consequences going forward are. If we turned everything around tomorrow, it may not make any difference, and that was, of course, Veblen's point. But we have to try, and we have to work in the world that we live in. And right now is not an optimistic period in terms of thinking about any sort of social change. We are just turning the bandits loose in the United States, and they're very good at what they do. I mean, this legend of Elon Musk as an entrepreneur, buying one company after another. I guess last night we were talking about he actually did do something once, right? It had to do with PayPal or something. But the 3 companies that he has right now, he didn't found those companies. He didn't create the technology. I doubt he can change a tire on his own Tesla. I'm sure he's got people to do that, but so this structure that we put in place has a tremendous amount of inertia, and of course the other part that goes with it is this is what seems normal and natural to most people. This is the world we grew up in. You know, it's familiar, it feels comfortable on a day-to-day basis, even as we look with dread at our future. You know, and of course for young people, it's terrible, you know. Until I had grandchildren, environmental considerations really weren't really big. I figured I'd be dead before anything happened, but I like them, so now I'm worried. You know, it's like, you know, so, you know, we have to do the best we can. There isn't any other option. What the best we can is, I don't know. It does not seem to be, you know, voting isn't really helping us out in the United States right now. Organizing isn't particularly good. Our political parties are both talking about the same thing. We have neoliberal and neoliberal light. And it's like, if you're going to have, you know, neoliberalism, go full bore, you know, just destroy things. It's like, if you're going to have a conservative government, do you want a real conservative government or a pretend conservative government? You know, might as well get the authentic thing in there. I don't know how any party can think that they can be just a little less conservative than the Conservative Party and be successful in electoral politics. And then, you know, how do we communicate? Well, we communicate through media, right? You know, when was the last time anybody went to a town hall meeting, you know? My students are really concerned about their freedom of speech. It's like, have you ever made a speech? Have you ever spoken publicly to anybody about anything? It's like, well, no. It's like, damn lot of good it's doing you, isn't it? You know, if you don't exercise those rights on a regular basis, if you don't take political action when you can, if you don't get up and say dangerous things and make trouble, then you're just complicit with what's going forward because the inertia will push it forward. And I'm sorry to be so depressing, but I can't even watch the news at home anymore. You know, it's like I get up in the morning and go, no, it's going to be worse. And it's going to be different tomorrow, so what difference does it make, you know? Is Canada part of the United States yet? Or is that still in the offing? You know, and of course that just removes one sanctuary for the rest of us looking for a place to go. You know? I don't think Greenland's on the table.
Also not an economist. Can I ask, so as Joan Robinson's granddaughter, tonight's like a unique opportunity for me to ask someone working still in economics now, what, if any, influence her work still has, and what maybe has been reevaluated as people have looked back on it over time?
Well, of course her work evolved. There's a lot of, when I look back at her career, I think one of the most important things is in economic philosophy, and the best reason to study economics is to not be fooled by economists. I think that's important. I think that her willingness to consider a wide range of alternatives, you know, and it's clear that she was not a Marxist, but she wasn't against contemplating the possibility of planning. She wasn't a mainstream economist, but she didn't disregard the fact that there was some competition of a very different type. She seemed to have a great deal of respect for the integrity of the individual. So there's a lot to learn there, and that is that, you know, we are very complex, and we have many dimensions to our lives, not all of which are economic in the sense that we generally think about that, and the more of that we bring into our economics, the better economists will be.
Okay. Can I ask a question? No. Go for it.
But early in her career, wasn't she more mainstream?
I'm not sure. She certainly was considered more mainstream because of the similarity between Chamberlain's monopolistic competition and her imperfect competition. But when you read those, the interpretation of the formalism is completely different. In other words, yes, the diagram was approximately the same, but her interpretation of it was that it was a waste, and Chamberlain thought it was wonderful that it was just another implicit market for variety, you know, which so how, for some reason, the mainstream thinks these are the same argument, but I don't think they actually are. So I think there's a really strong difference there. Did she use the Marshallian formalism? Everybody here did, so that was unavoidable. You know, I always thought if Keynes had decided not to write the book for economists, but to write it for human beings, it would have been a lot more understandable. And it would have been less likely to be misinterpreted by Hicks and others, right? I mean, when I read the general theory, the word equilibrium shows up, but I don't see an equilibrium system there. And of course, Nicholas Calder just said it's economics without equilibrium. But Keynes seemed hell-bent on being understood by the mainstream economists. And he says that right in the introduction. You know, this book is written for economists, professional economists, who were trained the way I was trained. And it's like, yeah, that was probably its undoing. I mean, at my institution, we teach political economy, and every student who goes through our economics program has to read the general theory. And it's amazing how many young macroeconomists we interview, and they haven't read it. And you know, it's just not that hard. And you know why it's easier now? Y'all had intermediate macroeconomics. You already know the terminology. He was having to develop that terminology for professional economists, and he was using concepts they were familiar with. But once you know that, undergraduates don't have much trouble following the general thing. There are parts, but they can get the gist of the argument.
But when you think about, when you think about the fact that Joan Robinson did not get the Nobel in economics, I mean, in the discipline, there's always been, at least within our community, that she didn't get it because she would have turned it down. Because if she had gotten it, it would have been for that earlier work, which she later disavowed. Is that an assessment that you agree with, or is that a mischaracterization of?
I don't know what the thinking of those people was. What I think is it was damned inconsiderate not to give her the option of turning it down.
Well, yeah.
I mean, there was no, if that was their thinking, that was just abominable, actually. You know, everybody's, if your thinking doesn't evolve over the course of your career, please don't be an academic. You know, I mean, you know, I
Do you think it was more because she was a woman?
yeah, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Sure. Sure. You know, if they wouldn't give her a degree, they certainly weren't going to give her the Nobel Prize. You know.
She was a professor here, but did not technically have a degree from Cambridge because women didn't get their full degrees until 1948. So look at that.
Because they didn't have degrees, Girton didn't even have fellows until the late 1920s. So she was ultimately a fellow at King's, not here.
The family law.
At Newnham first.
Oh, Newnham first, okay.
The family law, as I've heard it, is partly being a woman, but also partly that when she went to China, she came back and she was too happy about the model villages and that communism was so successful and there's no bugs and isn't this amazing? And I read that book while I was studying my A-level history on the CCP and did read it and go, oh, I don't think this is what was really happening. I think that you went to a model village.
Yeah.
I mean, does that factor into it? Do you think that being too positive about communism or the view of communism that she was given, does that factor into the Nobel decision, do you think?
What the Bank of Sweden takes into consideration is really difficult to fathom. You know, I mean, Barbara Wootton wrote 2 books about planning, Plan and No Plan, and she thought that all economies were planned, so that was kind of in the air at the time. So that might be the excuse, but I don't think it was the reason. You know, I mean, lots of people were enthusiastic about planning. You know, things like financial collapse of capitalism will bring that topic up on occasion. it just seems gratuitous. I mean, it just. By the way, Marge Turner in her book talks about that a great deal, but it's all speculation. Nobody really knows.
I have a question also following up on the importance of Joan Robinson. I wonder, the more and more I think about her legacy in Keynes, it comes to my mind this dichotomy between how we teach and do economics and the focus on micro, and the individual, the choice. And Joan Robinson was on the opposite side, right? Like trying to understand how the economy works at the aggregate level, the macro aspect. And I wonder if what we're going to see from now on, especially come from the US, that there are many mainstream economists saying you don't need macro anymore. And that has been reinforced by the fact that nowadays, in terms of quantitative methods, there's nothing. In the last 40 years, you can't see any way or any development of understanding aggregate variables, or most of the quantitative methods are in the micro level and the micro data. So I wonder if perhaps the importance of Joan Robinson in the future would be to rescue, attempt to understand society from a different perspective, not the micro one. Yeah.
Well, that's the interesting thing. As I was saying, we go back to, David Hume and John Locke, and we're talking about methodological individualism, and that's not part of the reality of our species. We're social. So why would you ever want to construct a microeconomics focused on individual behavior in isolation from other human beings, or at least analytically separable? It just doesn't happen. So its analytic power is limited to a certain kind of modeling construction that I think they've probably run that string as far as they can. And the obsession with having a microeconomic foundation of macroeconomics, why? Why is that necessary? Pick another arbitrary unit. Let's talk about the family and build an economics of the family. It would be equally absurd. And even in the mainstream, then they start working on the theory of clubs. Well, what's a club? It's like a cluster, only different. It's an undefined term for a group of people who have some common interest, and then you assume that they're going to optimize. We have a bunch of people here trained in economics and know how to do optimization problems, and I doubt they spend much time in the grocery store doing it.
But that's the concern as well, right? The generation of economists, they don't even know what macro is.
Yeah.
We are having, I think, in 10 years' time, we wouldn't have someone who actually even know what macroeconomic is.
I guess that's our job.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's concerning.
Well, there's a certain fascination, the agent-based modeling, complexity analysis, and hoping someday it adds up to an aggregate economy. Why? Don't we call that the fallacy of composition? Has that changed, or did that just drop out of logic at some point? There's no reason to think that summing up individual parts leads to social organization, social understanding. Certainly not to culture. And there is no way you can model culture. There is no mathematics that is open-ended enough and can incorporate the complexity of the culture understood by a 5-year-old, or the complexity of the language of a 5-year-old, and it's always growing. So that's kind of it might be an interesting sport. It might be a fun game. I did a field in microeconomics. I've taught microeconomics for years. My students go, how do you do that? And I said, well, I also like doing the New York Times crossword puzzle, and I think they're just about the same. It's just an exercise that I do that I can do, and I might as well get paid for it, but I never confuse it with reality. And it's not like there aren't very wise mainstream economists out there. It's just that's often independent of the theoretical framework that they're working in. in the United States government, for a long time, most economists needed to be interdisciplinary. Because if you're really going to make policy, you have to be able to talk to engineers, and you have to be able to talk to people with an understanding of politics. And as one of my friends who was an economist at the EPA said, there are no mainstream economists at the EPA. He said, if we need someone to say free the market, we can get a parrot and give it a cracker, it'll say free the market, and then we can move on with a serious discussion. He said, the mainstream economists can't pass the laugh test when talking about policy. You know, now there are good mainstream economists who do make good policy and can think about these things, but it's despite that analytic approach. The learning of logic, the thinking about these things, that's important, but the modeling itself is probably overemphasized, if not just a tragic error methodologically. But, you know, you make a good living at it.
Okay, so now I'm gonna make it 3 out of 3 Joan Robinson fellows asking a question about Joan Robinson. First of all, I thought it was very interesting that one of the questions that came from the family was about the relevance of Joan's work. And I think that something that is essential is that from the very beginning, she seemed to have a very clear idea of the social realm not being mechanistic. And I think that even though she had to speak the language of the Marshallians, at the same time when the general theory was written, she was very critical of all of these people who wanted to create the people that he called hydraulic Keynesians, or, excuse the language, your grandmother's language, bastard Keynesians. Yes, you know, the idea that you just treat the economy as some sort of a closed system where you just tweak some variable here and then you have this magical outcome on the other side. Now, I want to connect this with the so-called spring cleaning paper. Yes? Because Joan was an exceptional economist, but at the same time she had a very insightful understanding of philosophy. And towards the end of her career, that was the point where she realized that, you know what, I don't need these methods in order to say what I have to say. And many people thought that she was being nihilistic and, you know, that she was depressed or whatever. But in my view, this is perhaps the most insightful paper that she wrote. And I want to make a connection between this paper and some of the things that you mentioned. And in fact, the very first Joan Robinson workshop that we held last year, where Nuno Martins gave the first lecture. And he pointed out how Joan would speak about the notion of the rules of the game. And I think that this is something that would resonate with institutional economics a lot.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.